Hello, it's Eric Topol from Ground Truths, and I am really delighted to welcome Adam Kucharski, who is the author of a new book, Proof, a distinguished mathematician, by the way, the first mathematician we've had on Ground Truths, and a person who I had the real privilege of getting to know a bit through the COVID pandemic. So welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think just to let everybody know, you're a professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also noteworthy, you won the Adams Prize, which is one of the most impressive recognitions in the field of mathematics. This is the book. It's a winner, proof, and there's so much to talk about. So, Adam, maybe when I start off is the quote in the book that kind of captivates in the beginning. Life is full of situations that can reveal remarkably large gaps in our understanding of what is true and why it's true. This is a book about these gaps. So, what was the motivation when you undertook this very big endeavor?
I think a lot of it comes to the sort of work I do in my day job, where we have to deal with a lot of evidence under pressure, particularly if you work in outbreaks or emerging health concerns. And often it really pushes to the limits our methodology and how we converge on what's true, subject to potential revision in the future. I think particularly having a background in maths, I think you kind of grow up with this idea that you can get to these concrete, almost immovable truths, and then even just looking through the history, realizing that often isn't the case. That there's these kind of very human dynamics that play out around them, and it's something I think that everyone in science can reflect on. That sometimes what convinces us doesn't convince other people, and particularly when you have that kind of urgency of time pressure, working out how to navigate that.
Yeah, well, I think these times, of course, have really gotten us into appreciate, particularly during the during COVID, the importance of understanding uncertainty. Uh, and I think one of the ways that we can dispel what people assume they know is the famous Monty Hall, which you go about in the you get into a bit in the book. So I think everybody here is familiar with the show Let's Make a Deal, and maybe you can just take us through what happens with door number with one of the doors are unveiled and how that changes the mathematics.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a problem that's been around for a while, and it's based on this game show. So you've got three doors that are closed. Behind two of the doors are a goat, and behind one of the doors is a luxury car. So obviously you want to win the car. The host asks you to pick a door, so you point to one, maybe door number two. Then the host, who knows what's behind the doors, opens another door to reveal a goat, and then asks you, "Do you want to change your mind? Do you want to switch doors?" And a lot of the, I think, intuition people have, and certainly when I first came across this problem many years ago, is, well, you got two doors left, right? You know, you've picked one, there's another one, it's 50-50. And even some quite well respected mathematicians, people like Paul Erdos, who was, really published more papers than almost anyone else. Um, that was their initial gut reaction. But if you work through all of the combinations, if you pick this door and then the host does this and you switch or not switch and work through all of those options, you actually double your chances if you switch versus sticking with the door. So it's something that's counterintuitive, but I think one of the things that really struck me, and even over the years trying to explain it, is convincing myself of the answer, which was when I first came across it as a teenager, I did quite quickly, is very different to convincing someone else. And even actually, Paul Erdos, one of his colleagues, kind of showed him what I'd call proof by exhaustion. So go through every combination, and that didn't really convince him. So then he started to simulate and said, "Well, let's do a computer simulation of the game 100,000 times." And again, switching was this optimal strategy, but Erdos wasn't really convinced because okay, I accept that this is the case, but I'm not really satisfied with it. And I think that encapsulates for a lot of people their experience of proof and evidence. It's a fact, and you kind of have to take it as given, but there's actually quite a big bridge often to really understanding why it's true and feeling convinced by it.
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous example because I think everyone would naturally assume it's 50-50 and it isn't. And I think that gets us to the topic at hand. There's many things I love about this book. One is that you don't just get into science and medicine, but you cut across all the domains: law, mathematics, AI. So it's a very comprehensive sweep of everything about proof and truth. And it couldn't come at a better time, as we'll get into. Maybe just starting off with math, the term I love, mathematical monsters. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this was a fascinating situation that emerged in the late 19th century where a lot of maths had certainly in Europe had been derived from geometry because a lot of the ancient Greek influence on how we shape things, and then Newton and his work on rates of change and calculus. It was really the natural world that provided a lot of inspiration. These kind of tangible objects, tangible movements, and as mathematicians started to build out the theory around rates of change and how we tackle these kinds of situations, they sometimes took that intuition a bit too seriously, and there was some theorems that they said were intuitively obvious. Some of these French mathematicians, and so one, for example, was this idea of kind of how things change smoothly over time and how you do those calculations. But what happened was some mathematicians came along and showed that when you have things that can be infinitely small, that intuition didn't necessarily hold in the same way. And they came up with these examples that broke a lot of these theorems. And a lot of the establishment at the time called these things monsters. They called them like these aberrations against common sense. And this idea that if Newton had known about them, he never would have done all of his discovery because they're just nuisances and we just need to get rid of them. And there's this real tension at the core of mathematics in the late 1800s where some people just wanted to disregard this and say, look, it works for most of the time. That's kind of good enough. And then others really weren't happy with this quite vague logic. They wanted to put it on much sturdier ground. And what was remarkable actually is if you trace this then into the 20th century, a lot of these monsters and these, particularly in some cases, functions which could almost kind of move constantly, this kind of constant motion rather than what our intuitive concept of movement is something that's smooth. If you drop an apple, it kind of accelerates a very smooth rate, would become foundational in our understanding of things like probability, Einstein's work on atomic theory. A lot of these concepts where geometry breaks down would be really important in relativity. So actually, these things that we thought were monsters actually were all around us all the time, and science couldn't advance without them. So I think it's just this remarkable example of this tension within a field that's supposedly concrete, and the things that were going to be shunned actually turn out to be quite important.
It's great how you convey how nature isn't so neat and tidy, and things like Brownian motion, understanding that. I mean, just so many things that I think fit into that general category. In the legal, we won't get into too much because that's not so much the audience of ground truth, but the classic things about innocent until proven guilty and proof beyond reasonable doubt. I mean, these are obviously really important parts of that overall sense of proof and truth. We're going to get into one thing I'm fascinated about related to that subsequently. And then, in science, so before we get into the different types of proof, obviously the pandemic is still fresh on our minds, and we're an endemic of COVID now. And there were so many things we got wrong along the way of uncertainty and didn't convey that science isn't always evolving um, search for what is the truth. There's no shortage of uncertainty at any moment. So, can you kind of recap some of you did so much work during the pandemic, and obviously some of it's in the book. What were some of the major things that you took out of proof and truth from the pandemic?
I think it was almost this story of two halves, because on the one hand, science was the thing that got us where we are today. The reason that so much normality could resume and so much risk was reduced was development of vaccines and the understanding of treatments and the understanding of variants as they came to the characteristics. So it was kind of this amazing opportunity to see this happen faster than ever happened in history. And I think everyone in science, it certainly shifted a lot of my thinking about what's possible and even how we should think about these kinds of problems. But also, on the other hand, I think where people might have been more familiar with seeing science kind of progress a bit more slowly and reach consensus around some of these health issues, having that emerge very rapidly can present challenges. I mean, even we found with some of the work we did on alpha and then the delta variants, and it was the early quantification of these. So really, the big question is this thing more transmissible? Because at the time, countries were thinking about control measures, thinking about relaxing things, and you've got this just enormous social, economic, health decision making based around essentially is it a lot more spreadable or is it not? And you only had these fragments of evidence. So I think for me that was really an illustration of the sharp end. And I think what we ended up doing with some of those was rather than arguing over a precise number, something like delta, instead we kind of looked at, well, what's the range that matters? So in the sense of arguing over whether it's 40% or 50% or 30% more transmissible is perhaps less important than being it's substantially more transmissible and it's going to start going up. If is it going to go up extremely fast or just very fast? That's still a very useful conclusion. I think what often created some of the more challenges, I think the things that kind of on reflection people looking back pick up on are where there was probably overstated certainty. And we saw that around some of the airborne spread, for example, stated as a fact by, in some cases, some organizations. I think in some situations as well, governments had a constraint and presented it as scientific. So the UK, for example, would say testing isn't useful, and what they was happening at the time was there wasn't enough tests. So it was more a case of they can't test at that volume. But I think blurring between what the science was saying and what the decision making, and I think also one thing we found in the UK was we made a lot of the epidemiological evidence available. I think that was really, I think, something that was important. I found it a lot easier to communicate if talking to the media, to be able to say, look, this is the paper that's out. This is what it means. This is the evidence. I always found it quite uncomfortable having to communicate things where there was, you knew there were reports behind the scenes, but you couldn't actually articulate. But I think what that did is it created this impression that particularly epidemiology was driving the decision making a lot more than it perhaps was in reality, because it was so much of that was being made public, and a lot more of the evidence around education or economics was being done behind the scenes. I think that created this kind of asymmetry in public perception about how that was feeding in, and so I think there was always that. And it happens, it's really hard as well as a scientist when you've got journalists kind of asking you how to run the country to work out those steps of, am I describing the evidence behind what we're seeing? Am I describing the evidence about different interventions, or am I proposing, to some extent, my value system on what we do? And I think all of that in very kind of intense times can be very easy to get blurred together in public communication. I think we saw a few examples of that where things were being the follow the science on policy type angle, where actually once you get into what you're prioritizing within a society, quite rightly, you've got other things beyond just the epidemiology driving that.
Yeah, I mean, that term that you just used, follow the science, is such an important term because it tells us about the dynamic aspect. It isn't just a snapshot. It's, constantly being revised. But during the pandemic, we had things like the 6-foot rule that was never, supported by data, but yet still today, like if I walk around my hospital and there's still the footprints of the 6-foot rule, and not paying attention to the fact that this was airborne and took years before some of these things were accepted. The flatten the curve stuff with lockdowns, which I never was supportive of that, but perhaps at the worst point, the idea that hospitals would get overrun was an issue, but it got carried away with school shutdowns for prolonged periods, and in some parts of the world, especially, very stringent lockdowns. But anyway, we learned a lot. But perhaps one of the greatest lessons is that people's expectations about science is that it's absolute, and somehow you have this truth that's not there. I mean, it's getting revised. It's kind of on the job training. It's in this case on the pandemic revision, but very interesting. And that gets us to, I think, the next topic, which I think is a fundamental part of the book, distributed throughout the book, which is the different types of proof in biomedicine, and of course, across all these domains. And so you take us through things like randomized trials, p-values, 95% confidence intervals, counterfactuals, causation and correlation, peer review, the works, which is great because a lot of people have misconceptions of these things. So, for example, randomized trials, which is like the temple of the randomized trials, they're not as great as a lot of people think. Yes, they can help us establish cause and effect, but they're skewed because of the people who come into the trial. So they may not at all be a representative sample. What are your thoughts about over deference to randomized trials?
Yeah, I think that the story of kind of how we rank evidence in medicine is a fascinating one. I mean, even just how long it took for people to think about these elements of randomization. I mean, fundamentally, the what we're trying to do when we have evidence, in medicine or science, is prevent ourselves from confusing randomness for a signal. I mean, that's fundamentally, we don't want to mistake something, don't think it's going on when it's not. Um, and the challenge, particularly with any intervention, is you only get to see one version of reality. You can't give someone a drug, follow them, rewind history, not give them the drug, and then follow them again. So one of the things that essentially randomization allows us to do is, um, if you have two groups, one that's been randomized, one that hasn't, on average, the difference in outcomes between those groups is going to be down to the treatment effect. So it doesn't necessarily mean in reality that would be the case, but on average, that's the expectation that you'd have. And it's kind of interesting, actually, that the first kind of modern randomized controlled trial in medicine in 1947, this is for TB and streptomycin. The randomization element, actually, it wasn't so much statistical as behavioral. That, if you have people come into hospital, you could, to some extent, just say, we'll just alternate. We're not going to randomize. We're just going to, first patient we'll say is a control, second patient a treatment. But what they found in a lot of previous studies was, doctors have bias. Maybe that patient looks a little bit ill, or that one, maybe is on borderline for eligibility. And often you got these quite striking imbalances when you allowed it for human judgment. So it was really about kind of shielding against those behavioral elements. But I think there's a few situations. It's a really powerful tool for a lot of these questions. But as you mentioned, one is this issue of, you have the population you study on, and then perhaps in reality how that translates elsewhere. And we see, things like flu vaccines are a good example, which are very dependent on immunity and evolution and what goes on in different populations. Sometimes you've had a result on a vaccine in one place, and then the effectiveness doesn't translate in the same way to somewhere else. I think the other really important thing to bear in mind is, as I said, it's the averaging, that you're getting an average effect between two different groups. And I think we see certainly a lot of development around things like personalized medicine, where actually you're much more interested in the outcome for the individual. And so, what a trial can give you evidence of is, on average across a group, this is the effect that I can expect this intervention to have. But we've now seen more of the emergence of things like N=1 studies, where you can actually, over the same individual, particularly for kind of chronic conditions, look at those kind of interventions. And also there's just these extreme examples where you're ethically not going to run a trial. There's never been a trial of whether it's a good idea to have intensive care units in hospitals. Or there's a lot of these kind of historical treatments which are just so overwhelmingly effective that we're not going to run trials. So almost this hierarchy over time, you can see it getting shifted, because actually you do have these situations where other forms of evidence can get you either closer to what you need, or just more feasibly an answer where it's just not ethical or practical to do an RCT.
Yeah, and that brings us to the natural experiments. I just wrote about recently the one with shingles, which there's two big natural experiments to suggest that shingles might reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, an added benefit beyond the shingles that was not anticipated. Your thoughts about natural experiments, because here you're getting a much different type of population assessment. Again, not at the individual level, but not necessarily restricted by some potentially skewed enrollment criteria.
Yeah, I think this is has emerged as a really valuable tool. It's kind of interesting in the book, you're talking to economists like Josh Angrist, that a lot of these ideas emerge in epidemiology, but I think were really then taken up by economists, particularly as they wanted to add more credibility to a lot of these kind of policy questions. And ultimately, it comes down to this issue that for a lot of problems, we can't necessarily intervene and randomize, but there might be a situation that's done it to some extent for us. So the classic example is the Vietnam draft, where it was kind of random birthdays were drawn out of a lottery. And so there's been a lot of studies subsequently about the effect of serving in the military on different subsequent lifetime outcomes, because broadly those people have been randomized. It was for a different reason, but you've got that element of randomization driving that. And So again, with some of the recent shingles data and other studies, you might have a situation, for example, where there's been an intervention that's somewhat arbitrary in terms of time, like it's a cutoff on a birth date, for example, and under certain assumptions, you could think, well, actually, there's no real reason for the person on this day and this day to be fundamentally different. I mean, perhaps there might be effects of kind of cohorts if it's school years or this sort of thing, but generally, this isn't the same as having people who are very, very different ages and very different characteristics. It's just nature, or in this case, just a policy intervention for a different reason, has given you that randomization, which allows you, or kind of pseudo randomization, which allows you to then look at something about the effects of an intervention that you wouldn't as reliably if you were just kind of digging into the data of kind of yes, no, who's received a vaccine.
Yeah, no, I think it's really valuable, and now I think increasingly um, uh, as- given priority. If you can find these natural experiments, they're not always so abundant to use, to extrapolate from, but when they are, they're phenomenal. Um, the causation correlation is so big. The issue there, I mean, Judea Pearl's, why book, and you give so many great examples throughout the book of proof. I wonder if you could comment that on that a bit more, because this is where associations are confused somehow or other with a direct effect, and we unfortunately make these jumps all too frequently. Perhaps it's the most common problem that's occurring in the way we interpret medical research data.
Yeah, I think it's an issue that I think a lot of people get drilled into in their training. Just because there's a correlation between things doesn't mean that that thing causes this thing. But it really struck me as I talked to people researching the book, how in practice in research, there's actually a bit more to it in how it's played out. So first of all, if there's a correlation between things, it doesn't tell you much generally that's useful for intervention. If two things are correlated, it doesn't mean that changing that thing's going to have an effect on that thing, because there might be something that's influencing both of them. If you have more ice cream sales, it will lead to more heat stroke cases. It doesn't mean that changing ice cream sales is going to have that effect. But it does allow you to make predictions potentially, because if you can identify consistent patterns, you can say, okay, if this thing's going up, I'm going to make a prediction that this thing's going up. So one thing I found quite striking, actually, talking to research in different fields, is how many fields choose to focus on prediction, because it kind of avoids having to deal with this cause and effect problem. And even in fields like psychology, it was kind of interesting that there's a lot of focus on predicting things like relationship outcomes, but actually for people, you don't want a prediction about your relationship, right? You want to know, like, well, how can I do something about it? You don't just want someone to tell you your relationship's going to go downhill. So there's almost part of the challenge is people just got stuck on prediction because it's an easier field of work, whereas actually some of those problems will involve intervention. I think the other thing that really stood out for me is, in epidemiology and a lot of other fields, rightly, people are very cautious to not get that mixed up. They don't want to mix up correlations or associations with causation. But you've kind of got this weird situation where a lot of papers go out of their way to not use causal language and say it's an association, it's just an association, it's just an association, we can't say anything about causality. And then at the end of the paper, they'll say, well, we should think about introducing more of this thing or restricting this thing. So it's really the whole paper and its purpose is framed around a causal intervention, but it's extremely careful throughout the paper to not frame it as a causal claim. So I think you're almost, by skirting that too much, we actually avoid the problems that people sometimes care about. And I think a lot of the nice work that's been going on in causal inference is trying to get people to confront this more head on, rather than say, okay, you can just stay in this prediction world and and that's fine, and then just later maybe make a policy suggestion off the back of it.
Yeah, I think this cause and effect is a very alluring concept to support proof, as you so nicely go through in the book. But of course, one of the things that we use to help us is the biological mechanism, right? So here you have, let's say, for example, you're trying to get a new drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And the request is, well, we want two trials, randomized trials, independent. We want to have p-values that are significant, and we want to know the biological mechanism, ideally with a dose response of the drug. But there are many drugs as you review, that have no biological mechanism established. And, even when the tobacco problems were mounting, the actual mechanism of how tobacco use caused cancer wasn't known. So, how important is the biological mechanism, especially now that we're well into the AI world where explainability is demanded? And so we don't know the mechanism, but we also don't know the mechanism in lots of things in medicine too, like anesthetics and, you know, even things as simple as aspirin, how it works, and many others. So how do we deal with this quest for the biological mechanism?
I think that's a really good point. And it kind of shows almost a lot of the transition I think we're going through currently. And I think particularly for things like, things like smoking cancer, where it's very hard to run a trial. You can't make people randomly take up smoking. Having those additional pieces of evidence, whether it's an analogy with a similar carcinogen, whether it's a biological mechanism, can help almost give you more supports for that argument that there's a cause and effect going on. But I think what I found quite striking, and I realized actually that it's something that had kind of bothered me a bit, and I'd be interested to hear whether it bothers you. But with the emergence of AI, it's almost a bit of the kind of the loss of scientific satisfaction. I think you kind of grow up with learning about how the world works and why this is doing what it's doing. And I talked, for example, of some of the people involved with AlphaFold and some of the subsequent work in storing those predictions about structures, and they'd almost kind of made peace with it, which I found kind of interesting, because I think they started off being a bit uncomfortable with, like, you've got these remarkable AI models making these predictions, but we sort of don't understand still biologically what's happening here. But I think they'd just settled and saying, well, biology is really complex on some of these problems, and if we can have a tool that can give us this extremely valuable information, maybe that's okay. And it was just interesting that they'd really kind of gone through that kind of process, which I think a lot of people are still grappling with, and that almost that discomfort of using AI, and what's going to convince you that that's a useful, reliable prediction, whether it's something like predicting protein folding or getting in a self-driving car. What's the evidence you need to kind of convince you that's reliable.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up because when I when Demis Hassabis and John Jumper won the Nobel Prize, the point I made was, well, maybe there should be an asterisk with AI because they don't know how it works. I mean, they had all the rich data from the protein data bank, and they got the transformer model to do it for 200 million protein structure prediction, but they still to this day don't fully understand how the model really was working. So it reinforces what you're just saying, and of course, it cuts across so many types of AI. It's just that we tend to hold different standards in medicine, not realizing that there's lots of lack of explainability for routine medical treatments today. Now, one of the things that I found fascinating in your book, because there's different levels of proof, different types of proof, but solid logical systems. And on page 60 of the book, especially pertinent to the US right now, there is a bit about Kurt Godel. And what he did there was he basically there was a question about a dictatorship in the U.S. Could it ever occur? And he says, Godel says, yes, it can. I can prove it. And he's using the Constitution itself to prove it, which I found fascinating because, of course, we're seeing that emerge right now. Can you give us a little bit more about this? Because this is fascinating about, the Fifth Amendment. And I mean, I never thought that the Constitution would allow for a dictatorship to emerge.
And this was a fascinating story, because it's this Kurt Gödel, who's like one of the greatest logical minds of the 20th century, and did a lot of work, particularly in the kind of early 20th century, around system of rules, particularly in things like mathematics, and whether they can ever be really fully satisfying. So, in particularly in mathematics, he showed that there were this problem that it's very hard to have a set of rules for something like arithmetic that was both complete and covered every situation, but also had no contradictions. And I think a lot of countries, if you go back things like the Napoleonic Code And these attempts to almost write down every possible legal situation that could be imaginable always just descended into either they needed amendments or they had contradictions. I think Gödel's work really summed it up. And there's a story, this is in the kind of late 40s when he had his citizenship interview, and kind of Einstein and Oscar Morgenstern went along as these kind of witnesses for him. And it's always told as kind of a light-hearted story, as, this, this logical mind, this academic, just saying something silly in front of the judge. And it actually, to my own admission, I've in the past given talks and mentioned it in this slightly kind of light-hearted way. But for the book, I got talking to a few people who'd taken it more seriously. I realized actually, he is this extremely logically focused mind at the time, and maybe there should have been something more to it. And people who've kind of dug more into possibilities were sort of saying, well, what could he have spotted that bothered him? And a lot of his work that he did about consistency in maths was around particularly self-referential statements. So if I say this sentence is false, it's kind of self-referential, and if it is false, then it's true, but if it's true, then it's false, and you get these kind of weird self-referential contradictions. And so one of the theories about Gödel was that in the Constitution, it wasn't that there was a kind of rule for someone can become a dictator, but rather people can use the mechanisms within the Constitution to make it easier to make further amendments. And he kind of called it sort of downward cycle of amendment that he had seen happening in Europe in the run up to the war. And again, because this is never fully documented exactly what he thought, but it's one of the theories that it wouldn't just be outright, that it would just be this cyclic process of weakening and weakening and weakening and making it easier to add. And actually, when I wrote that, it was one of the earlier bits of the book that I drafted, I did sort of debate whether including it. I thought, is this actually just a bit in the weeds of kind of American
No,
history?
no, it
And
isn't.
here we are. Yeah, it's remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I found it, quite, it struck me when I was reading this, because here back in 1947, there was somebody predicting that this could happen based on some, you know, if you want to call it loopholes, if you will, or ability to change things, even though you would have thought otherwise that there wasn't any possible capability for that to happen. Now, one of the things I thought was a bit contradictory is two parts here. One is from Angus Deaton. He wrote, "Gold standard thinking is magical thinking." And then the other is what you basically are concluding in many respects. To navigate proof, we must reach into a thicket of errors and biases. We must confront monsters, we've talked about a bit, and embrace uncertainty, balancing and rebalancing our beliefs. We must seek out every useful fragment of data, gather every relevant tool, searching wider and climbing further, finding the good foundations among the bad, dodging dogma and falsehoods, questioning, measuring, triangulating, convincing. Then perhaps, just perhaps, we'll reach the truth in time. So here you have, on the one hand, your search for the truth, proof, which I think that little paragraph says it all in many respects. It sums up so much of the work that you review here. And on the other, you have this Nobel laureate saying, you don't have to go to extremes here. The enemy of good is perfect, perhaps. I mean, how do you reconcile this sense that, you shouldn't go so far? Don't search for absolute perfection of proof.
Yeah, I think that encapsulates a lot of what the book is about, is that search for certainty, and how far do you have to go? And I think one of the things so Dayton, there's a lot of interest and discussion here, some fascinating kind of papers around at what point do you use these studies? What are their flaws? But I think one of the things that does stand out is across fields, across science, medicine, even if you go into kind of law, AI, having these kind of cookie cutter, this is the definitive way of doing it. And if you just follow this simple rule, if you do your p-value, you'll get there and you'll be fine. And I think that's where a lot of the danger is. And I think that's what we've seen over time, certainly in science, people kind of chasing certain targets and all the behaviors that come around that, or in certain situations, disregarding valuable evidence because you've got this kind of gold standard, and nothing else will do. And I think particularly in a crisis, it's very dangerous to have that, because you might have a sort of lower level of evidence that demands a certain action, and you almost bias yourself towards inaction if you have these kind of very simple thresholds. So I think for me, across all of these stories and across the whole book, I mean, William Gossett, who did a lot of pioneering work on statistical experiments at Guinness in the early 20th century, he had this nice question he sort of framed is how much do we lose? And it's kind of, if we're thinking about the problems, there's always more studies we can do. There's always more confidence we can have. But whether it's a patient we want to treat or a crisis we need to deal with, we need to work out actually getting that level of proof that's really appropriate for where we are currently.
Yeah, it's I think exceptionally important that there's this kind of spectrum or continuum in the following science and search for truth, and that distinction, I think, really nails it. Now, one of the things that's unique in the book is you don't just go through all the different types of how you would get to proof, but you also talk about how the evidence is acted on. And for example, you quote, they spent a lot of time misinforming themselves. This is the whole idea of taking data and torturing it or using it, dredging it, however way you want to support either conspiracy theories or, alternative facts, basically manipulating, sometimes even emasculating what evidence and data we have. And one of the sentences, or I guess that this is from Sir Francis Bacon, truth is the daughter of time, but the added part is not authority. So here we have our president here that repeats things that are wrong, fabricated or wrong, and he keeps repeating to the point that people believe it's true. But on the other hand, you could say truth is a daughter of time because you like to not accept any truth immediately. You like to see it get replicated and further supported, backed up. So in that one sentence, truth is a daughter of time, not authority, there's the whole, ball of wax here. Can you take us through that? Because I just think that people don't understand that that truth being tested over time, but also manipulated by its repetition. This is a part of the big problem that we live in right now.
Yeah, and I think it's something that writing the book and actually just reflecting on it subsequently has made me think about a lot, in just how people approach these kind of problems. And I think that there's some idea that conspiracy theorists are just lazy and have maybe just fallen for a random thing. But talking to people, you really think about these things a lot more in the field, and actually the more I've ended up engaging with people who believe things that are just outright unevidenced around vaccines or around health issues, they often have this mountain of papers and data to hand. And a lot of it often will be peer reviewed papers. It won't necessarily be supporting the point that they think it's supporting.
Right, right.
But it's not something that you can just say everything you're saying is false. That there's actually often a lot of things that have kind of been put together, and then it's just that leap to that conclusion. I think you also see a lot of scientific language kind of borrowed. So I gave a talk earlier this year, and it got posted on YouTube. It had conspiracy theories in it, and there was a lot of conspiracy theory supporters who sort of piled in the comments. And one of the points they made is skepticism is good. It's the kind of Royal Society. Take no one's word for it. You need this. This is we're the ones that are kind of doing science, and people who just assume that science is settled are in the wrong. So, and again, you also mentioned that repetition. I mean, there's this phenomenon. It's kind of the illusory truth problem, that if you repeatedly tell someone something's false, it will increase their belief in it, even if it's something quite outrageous. And that mimics that scientific repetition, because people kind of say, okay, but if I've heard it again and again, it's almost like if you treat these as mini experiments, I'm just accumulating evidence that this thing is true. So it's made me think like a lot about how you've got essentially a lot of mimicry of the scientific method of, amount of data and how you present it, and, this kind of skepticism being good. But I think a lot of it comes down to it as well as just looking at these logical flaws, but also ability to be wrong. In not actually seeking out things that confirm. I think all of us, it's something that I've certainly tried to do a lot working on emergencies, and that one of the scientific advisory groups that I worked on, almost it became a catchphrase. Whenever someone presented something, they finished by saying, "Tell me why I'm wrong." And like if you've got a variant that's more transmissible, I don't want to be right about that. Really, and it's something that is quite hard to do. And I found it, particularly for something that's quite high pressure, trying to get a policymaker or someone to write, yeah, even just non-publicly by themselves, write down what you think's going to happen, or write down what would convince you that you're wrong about something. I think particularly on contentious issues where someone's got perhaps a lot of kind of public persona wrapped up in something, that's really hard to do. But I think it's those kind of elements that distinguish between kind of getting sucked into a conspiracy theory and really seeking out evidence that supports it and trying to just get your theory stronger and stronger, and actually seeking out things that might overturn your belief about the world. And it's often those things that we don't want overturned. I think those are the views that we all have politically or in other ways, and that's often where the problems lie.
Yeah, I think this is perhaps one of, if not the most essential part here, is that to try to deal with the different views, we have biases, as you emphasized throughout. But if you can use these different types of proof to have a sound discussion, conversation, refutation, whereby you don't summarily dismiss another view, which may be skewed and may be spurious, just absolutely wrong, maybe fabricated, whatever, but that you can engage and say, here's why, these are my proof points, or this is why there's some extent of certainty you can have regarding this view of the data. I think this is so fundamental because, unfortunately, as we saw during the pandemic, the strident minority, which were the anti-science, anti-vaxxers, they were summarily dismissed as being, kooks and adopting conspiracy theories without the right engagement and the right debates. And I think this might have helped along the way. No less the fact that a lot of scientists didn't really want to engage in the first place, and adopt this methodical proof that you've advocated in the book. So many different ways to support a hypothesis or an assertion. Now we've covered a lot here, Adam. Have I missed some central parts of the book and the effort? Because it's really quite extraordinary. I know it's your third book, but it's certainly a standout, and it's a standout not just for your books, but books on this topic.
Thanks, and it's much appreciated. It was not an easy book to write. I think at times I kind of wondered if I should have taken on the topic, but I think a cool thing. Your last point kind of speaks to that. I think a cool thing is that gap often between what convinces us and what convinces someone else. I think it's often very tempting as a scientist to say, the evidence is clear, or the science has proved this. But even on something like the vaccines, you do get the loud minority who perhaps think they're putting microchips in people, and these kind of outlandish views. But you actually get a lot more people who might just have some skepticism of pharmaceutical companies, or they might have, my wife was pregnant actually at the time during COVID, and she was, we weighed it up because there wasn't much data on pregnancy and the vaccine. And I think it's just finding, what is convincing. Is it having more studies from other countries? Is it understanding more about the biology? Is it, understanding how you evaluate some of those safety signals? And I think that's just really important to not just think what convinces us and it's going to be obvious to other people, but actually think, where are they coming from? Because ultimately, having proof isn't that good unless it leads to the action that can make lives better.
Yeah. Well, look, you've inculcated my mind with this book, and proof. Anytime I think of the word proof, I'm going to be thinking about you. So thank you. Thanks for taking the time to have a conversation about your book, your work, and I know we're going to count on you for the astute mathematics and analyses of outbreaks in the future, which we will see. Unfortunately, we're seeing now, in fact, already in this country with measles and whatnot. So thank you, and we'll continue to follow your great work.